I've known our guest today, Blaine Harden, since the 1970s, when we were both Cub reporters in New Jersey. And I'm really, really thrilled to be introducing him again here. As I've said about Blaine before, he's a genuine craftsman, not just a fine writer and an intelligent fact finder, but someone who takes real pride in the process of discovery and the art of putting it all down on paper. He had a terrific run at the Washington Post, where he was for 28 years. He served as bureau chief in East Asia, Eastern Europe, and Africa. He's also been a local and national correspondent for the New York Times. We'll give him that, and a writer for Time Magazine. And he's reported for PBS Frontline, The Economist, Foreign Policy, National Geographic, and The Guardian. Blaine was last here a couple of years ago for his book Escape from Camp 14. You know, that's the riveting story of Shin Dong-hyuk, the only person born in a North Korean prison camp to have escaped to the West. Shin has recently acknowledged making some inaccurate statements about what happened to him, but there's still every reason to believe that he was subjected to some horrific torture and other cruelties in a North Korean camp or camps. And I know Blaine is ready to discuss the controversy this evening. There's a revised edition of Escape from Camp 14 with a new foreword that's out, and Blaine can talk more about that later. But his main focus this evening is his new book, The Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot, which also is set in North Korea. As the title suggests, the book weaves together two gripping narratives. One is the story of Kim Il-sung's rise to power as the first communist dictator of North Korea. And the second is the story of No Kum Sok, a young North Korean pilot who in 1953, just weeks after the end of the Korean War, caused an international sensation by stealing a Soviet MiG-15 and flying it to South Korea to hand over to the Americans. Blaine has been able to deepen our understanding of both these stories by drawing on documents from the Chinese and Russian archives about Kim, and also drawing on recently declassified U.S. Air Force intelligence reports on No. No himself is also with us this evening. A U.S. citizen since 1962, he's had a very successful career working for some major U.S. firms and at various points teaching engineering and thermodynamics. His name is now Kenneth Rowe, and he'll be in conversation here with Blaine after Blaine takes a little bit of time at the start describing the book. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming both men.
Does it work now? Okay, great. So Ken and I have had many discussions, but this is our first discussion with an audience. And I'm quite excited about it. Before I started asking him questions about his amazing life in North Korea and China and in the United States, I want to just quickly sort of set up what this book's about and what I think it can help you, the way in which it can help you understand contemporary North Korea. The book is really set in the 40s and 50s, but North Korea hasn't changed much. So North Korea is unique in that it's lasted so long as a totalitarian state. These kind of states generally burn out after a period of time. And as you can see, North Korea has lasted more than twice as long as any other state of this kind, 67 years with no end in sight. What's also true about totalitarian states or dictatorships in general is they tend to be pretty much, their livelihood tends to end when the great leader kicks the bucket or is thrown out of power. Hitler died, Nazi Germany's gone. Stalin died, and the Gulag melted away within 2 or 3 years in the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union stayed intact for a couple more decades, but it was fundamentally changed when Stalin died. And when Mao died, China fundamentally changed. It became the strange amalgam of capitalism and top-down control that we now know. Why is North Korea the exception to this? It's had 3 leaders, and this is the grandson, Kim Jong-un. And what I try to explain in this book is why North Korea persists as a totalitarian state through 3 different changes in leadership. And it comes down to this guy, Kim Il-sung, the great leader. He, in a sense, I describe him in the book as probably the most successful leader of the 20th century, inasmuch as the state that he created is still run by the rules that he created and basically run by the same people that he created, his son and grandson. He, kind of like a clockmaker god, he put North Korea into operation, and then he froze time. In North Korea, inside North Korea, it's as if the 1950s never ended. And certainly memory of the Korean War is much more present in the minds of most North Koreans than it is in our minds, for example. And we were the combatants in that war. But also the story is animated by the amazing escape of Ken Rowe. And I'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, I want to just give you a sense of who Kim Il-sung was and why his influence is still so great in North Korea. He grew up largely in Manchuria, in northeastern China. He left North Korea when he was 7 years old. It wasn't North Korea then, and he became an anti-Japanese fighter and then an anti-Japanese guerrilla leader, and he was really good at it, especially for a young man. He led a number of raids into Korea. They weren't big, but they were very successful. He nipped into North Korea and killed some Japanese policemen and got lots of publicity for it. And he became legendary. His name became known up and down the Korean peninsula. What the Korean people didn't know was how young he was. He was still in his 20s when he was doing these amazing feats and becoming a Korean legend. But in the end, the Japanese wiped him out, wiped out all of his anti-Japanese guerrillas, and his movement ended. He was very lucky, though. He escaped off to the Soviet Far East and became a captain in the Soviet Army. He studied some communism doctrine there. He had a family. The cute young man there is Kim Jong-il, the dear leader. And he, as a captain in the Russian army, he became known to Stalin's men who occupied North Korea after the division of the Korean Peninsula in 1945. So he was brought in as a malleable puppet, someone who would do what they asked him to do, but who also, because he had this legend of being a successful fighter against the Japanese, he had a certain populist base that the Russians really needed to establish a puppet state in North Korea. And when he arrived in 1945, he quickly became more than a puppet. He had a certain demagogic magic. He could sense the fears and the desires of the North Korean people, and he could convert those fears and desires into his power. And he became a formidable leader on his own. There were 34,000 of these kinds of statues in North Korea at last count. He became more Stalinist than Stalin, building the political labor camps that are now so famous. He sorted the population based on loyalty, putting the most disloyal people at a distance from the capital. He spent most of the money of the government on heavy machinery and then on the military. He controlled information. He turned the country into a kind of prison with him as the chief warden. But one thing he also did is he sweet-talked and charmed Stalin. In 1949 and 1950, he persuaded, he begged, he cajoled Stalin into giving him the arms necessary to invade South Korea. In 1950, Stalin gave him the go-ahead, gave him the tanks, gave him the armaments, and he invaded the South. And for a few weeks, he was a genius. His tanks rolled across most of South Korea, all the way down to the southern tip, almost. And the Americans were caught with their pants down. They had a poor military, an army in Japan that they sent in that got defeated very quickly. But in a few weeks' time, the Americans figured out how to strike back. And this is a very important thing that I think that Americans should really realize about how the Korean War was conducted. The Americans struck back at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end by bombing North Korea. They bombed it virtually every day for 3 years using these big B-29s, the planes that bombed Tokyo, set Tokyo ablaze during World War II. And they really savaged North Korea. They destroyed every city, town, and village in the country. The Soviets estimated after the war that 85% of the structures in the country had been knocked down, which is an incredible amount of destruction. American leaders described the bombing as horrendous, and these are a couple quotes from Dean Rusk and from General Curtis LeMay. LeMay's estimate of 20% of the population killed is really a staggering amount of death given the size of the country. There were about 10 million people in the country at the time, and perhaps 2 million, 1.9, maybe less, were killed. If you think about that and project it on what would have happened in the United States if this kind of destruction had gone on during that period, 30 million Americans would have been killed. So this is important to realize, and Americans did not pay much attention to this during the war, and American historians have not paid too much attention to it since the war. But they paid very careful attention in North Korea. And one of the ways to understand why North Korea seems so wildly angry at America is because they're obsessed with the Korean War. The way the Kim dynasty obtains legitimacy is by constantly reminding the population of what the Americans did to the war and saying, sure, it's dark, it's poor, it's isolated in North Korea, but that's the price of protecting you against the Americans. And if we don't protect you, they might come again. And it has been a very effective fact-based narrative that had helped legitimize a regime that certainly has caused a lot of suffering. Yep. So we've lost our pictures. No, we're doing the Windows update, it looks like. Oh my God. All right, well, so you see in those pictures. What I try to do in this book is to animate a history lesson with the story of a young boy who then was known as No Kum Sok. He grew up in a family. His father worked for a Japanese company, and he was relatively well off. And if the pictures worked, I would show you pictures of him riding a tricycle, of his mother wearing furs, of his father in a baseball uniform. He had a life that was different than most Koreans on the Korean Peninsula, in that his father had a good job and a relatively middle-class existence. when the Russians came in 1945, his father lost his job. The Japanese were chased out. His father got cancer, and he died when Ken was 17. And Ken had to figure out a way to survive. He also, when he was 16, he had the good fortune of seeing the great leader in person. In his hometown, at a big fertilizer factory, Kim came to give a talk. No saw him, heard what he had to say, and decided that he didn't want any part of that. And he tried to figure out a way to get out of the country. His decision was to join the Naval Academy, become the youngest fighter pilot in the North Korean Air Force, get his hands on a MiG, and at the right moment, get out. So with that introduction, let me just ask some questions of Ken, and then you can ask some questions of both of us. So Ken, why did you dislike the great leader so much?
Well, I have never been a communist. I just hated. I hated Soviet Union. Kim was appointed by the Soviet Union, and he just followed the Soviet system, and we just disliked him. Besides, you look at South Korea, they were building up the democratic country. I wish that I'm in South Korea to compare two countries. So I became an anti-communist from then on. I was not just a normal anti-communist. I thought that I was a #1 anti-communist wherever I was, of course in hiding. And in my system, I want somehow to fight back, but I could not fight back. So only way would be get out of there. But I was too young. I was 13 years old in 1945. If I go to South Korea, how do I live and how can I go to school? So I didn't go. So I stayed there and went to school. And then my father passed away, and I wanted to go to I wanted to take the higher education. There's one university in North Korea known as the Kim Ilsung University. Not many people can attend unless his family is a communist. Otherwise, a regular student cannot go there. So I just gave up that school. And then I saw this ad appeared on the bulletin board that the Naval Cadet applicant for the Naval Academy cadets. And I figured out that the Naval Cadet is sort of a Navy university. I can get a college education even though I'm not a communist. I thought that's better than not getting the college education. So that's why I went to the Naval Academy. And my goal was after I become a naval officer and I had a chance to ride a patrol boat, I want to escape South Korea by using the patrol boat. That was my dream was when I went there. But when I went to the Naval Academy, before I went there, I had a second thought. I'm such a strong anti-communist. Why should I go to the Communist Military Academy? But then I had to think back and forth. Then finally I said, I go. I can tolerate their indoctrination. But when I went there, that was a tough place. #1, I was an anti-communist. That alone, and getting all more indoctrination. And then this was so harsh, I couldn't tolerate. I felt like to quit. And then I didn't have any chance. One cadet applied for the resignation. He got in big trouble. So I gave up my, I thought of quitting the Naval Academy. I stayed on.
Well, how did you get from the Naval Academy to the Air Force?
And then what happened was that the war started, and our campus was all gone. We live in a railroad tunnel. That's where our barrack was, to protect from the area of bombardment. And then one morning, after the U.S. Marines landed on Incheon, naval doctors came and gave a physical exam. And I thought that that looks like they are sending them to the Air Force training. I knew. They didn't say. We could not talk about anything. We were in the big trouble for rumor mongering. So we just shut our mouths. I knew they were recruiting the pilots. If I go to that training, I could become a pilot. If I became a pilot, I might escape by air. That came to my mind. But I was not one of them. They asked to take a physical exam. This is randomly. They selected half of the cadets in my class. They gave a physical exam. And then I know the spinning test. Some are falling down on the ground after spinning around about 20 times on the ground. I know they were not accepted. I saw the professor who was scoring that test score. He was the professor of the Russian Communist Bolshevik Party history professor. I got an A from his class. And I stood beside him and I watched him when he's scoring. I knew that they were flunked, they were not passing. So I asked him that, comrade professor, could I take that test? And then he was hesitant. He lifted the head on here of a couple of seconds. Yeah, go ahead and take. I thought, oh, that's it. That was my happiest moment in my life. I didn't have any problem passing those spinning tests. So that's why I went to Air Force. Before they say anything, I knew we are going to Air Force. That was my happiest moment, other than my escape to South Korea. That's why I went to the Air Force.
So who taught you to fly?
First, we have to learn how to fly the propeller planes. We went by train to the Manchuria. Manchuria is the Chinese Manchuria. Chinese don't call Manchuria anymore now. If you go to China and ask where is Manchuria, they don't know. That's like you go to New York City and where is the LaGuardia Airport? They don't know. They don't call it Manchuria. But we went to Manchuria. Train was crossing over the Manchuria. And then went to the place called the Yanji. Yanji is the Korean autonomous region. Many Koreans live there, almost like Korea. That's where North Korean Air Force went there after they lost everything, reviving. They were resurrecting the North Korean Air Force. That's what we got there. And we went there, and the following morning, commander came and told us that you become a pilot. My guess was exactly correct. So we got into the training, but we know nothing about the airport. However, we were the Naval Academy. We were the best educated person flying the plane. You know, those Air Force people never went to college. They didn't know about the high math or about the ideal gas laws. So we knew more than them. However, we didn't know anything about the airplane. We never been in any plane, even nearby there. We saw the plane flying. We didn't know what that it was. So they have to teach us what the plane was, theory. And then we started taking the flight training.
Who were your teachers?
Teachers were North Korean pilots who survived the Korean War.
And then?
And then after they taught us how to fly propeller planes, then we didn't know what kind of plane we are supposed to fly. We were supposed to fly the fighter planes. And then the Russians came and they said that we were trained to become a jet pilot. What kind of jet pilot? Swept-wing jet pilot. We said, oh, that's great. We were all pleased. And then they turned over us to the Soviet air base in the western Manchuria. When they got there, Soviet Union deployed their Air Force unit there to train Koreans. What happened was that when Chinese army entered the Korean War, Chinese needed air support. They asked the Russians. The Russians didn't want to fight, but because of Chinese ask, they cannot just stand by doing nothing. In fact, they started the war. And then they deployed the Soviet MiG pilots, very inexperienced initially. And they were disguised as Chinese pilot, Chinese insignia, and told them to speak Chinese in the air. You know,
Which they couldn't do.
Yeah, they cannot speak Chinese. Besides, since they cannot speak Chinese, they just didn't use the radio, except when they are in trouble. Then they start shouting with the Russian language. The American knew that. That's why Russians in a rush to train the North Koreans fly the MiG, so that they want to deploy the North Koreans to the war. So the North Koreans use the radios with the Korean language, they can shout, then see, North Koreans are fighting now. That's why they're in a rush, the crash program, so that they trained us to become a MiG pilots. But you cannot rush too much. We have to learn step by step. So we went there, and that's early 1951. And about in summertime, we all soloed and become MiG pilots. And I thought that we need a lot more training. You know, then they were rush and we did the formation, fly the air, acrobatics and some simulated dogfights. I thought we are not ready. And then they said, okay, you are now going to war. I complained to the Russian pilots, we are not ready. You know, I can tell that the Russians, not the North Koreans. Then I get in trouble. Yeah, I spoke Russian fairly well. In fact, I spoke Russian better than other North Koreans. And then I asked a Russian instructor that we are not ready. He said, what do you mean you are not ready? When we fought against Germans, we flew less hours than you. Yeah, I thought that doesn't make any sense. You know, Germans were losing the war near the end of the war. They didn't fly many hours. Then they fought against Germans. I said, Americans flew more than 1,000 hours. Then I was careful not to talk too much about them. So what could I do? I cannot stop going. Why we didn't have enough training was that, number one, we didn't have enough combat simulating dogfights. The other thing is that in order to be a good pilot, you have to know how to fly that plane at the maximum performance capabilities, such as how fast the airplane goes. You go to maximum speed. If you go beyond that speed, what happened? They didn't do that. In fact, the Russians probably didn't fly that fast. And plane goes very high, more than American planes. If you go to higher, what happened? We didn't learn that kind of thing. And then what about the shooting the enemies? You know, we didn't fire the guns at all.
You had no practice shooting the guns.
Yeah, I never fired the guns before we went to war. Oh, that's ridiculous. I thought that in order to be a good pilot, of course you have to fire the gun. And of course you have to do the with a gun camera to have a simulated dogfights. And also you have to fire a real gun. And some planes should pull the targets, you know, like a drum with attached there, and fire real ammunition to see how this is going out. Especially MiG has automatic cannons. You know, that's not the regular machine gun. And see how you feel. We didn't do that. Oh, that's ridiculous.
Now, speaking of shooting,
Yeah.
There was one opportunity you had when you were on a runway and your MiG was being inspected by the great leader and his son, the dear leader. What happened then?
Yeah, that North Kim Il-sung he wanted to see the MiG before we entered the war. And there's only one MiG airfield was constructed in North Korean side of the Yellow River. And that's where Kim Il-sung came. He wanted to see MiGs. So we have about 8 pilots flew from China to the landed there so that he can see. So he came see the plane. And we lined up and I stood up there, one of the pilots. We cannot talk to him. And they gave me enough warning that if we have a shake hands with him, don't hold too tight. He's our dear leader. And we stood up and watched what he was doing. And he looked around the planes and his son was also there. And look inside there. He asked his son that, would you like to fly this kind of plane? He said, yes. Oh, to do so, you have to study hard. And then he said that, a plane like this, you can't even kill the granddaddy of the Americans. Yeah, that's what he was saying. He knew nothing about the plane. And he looked around there and a few words here and there. And we stood up. And then after that, he just disappeared. At that time, I had an automatic pistol in my waist. I could have killed him. You know, I was the #1 anti-communist wherever I was in North Korea. But I had a second thought. I can do more than just killing him. If I kill him, then I die anyway. They kill me. So I thought that I had a better idea. Someday, I want to fly a plane and go to the American side and land there. And I can help them out so that they can destroy more communist Air Force planes. So I didn't shoot him. So I chickened out there. Yeah, I didn't. So we went back to Manchuria after that.
Right. During the war, you flew more than 100 combat missions. And during many of those missions, you faced off against American Sabre jets, F-86 planes. Did you ever shoot down an American plane?
Yeah, I didn't. Not I didn't. Of course, I didn't have any chance. You know, they always fly large formations. That I didn't like that. The squadron commander lead typically 24 planes, and we follow him. And he goes to some place there that the Americans are waiting, and then they stop coming down and shoot him down. They mix up. Sometimes I had some chance to shoot at the plane, but most of the time we were attacked by Americans. Americans didn't fly with larger planes. You know, Americans come from South Korea, go to North Korea, smaller groups, and they see the big formation come out with the vapor trails. Oh, those planes come out, so they can see about 60, 70 miles away. They can see, oh, there they are. They just start coming around and how to attack the MiGs. I thought those MiG pilots were stupid, you know. It's like a smart man like me. If I were the commander, I could have managed much better. I was not the commander. What could I do? I cannot complain to them. So I just followed them. So sometimes you mixed up, then you start fighting. You had a chance to shoot at the American planes. In fact, one time, I really had a chance. But I mixed up. Then one F-86 was right in my gun sight. And if I fired, I knew I could have shot down. Of course, my desire was not anxious to shoot down, because my desire was to escape someday. I thought it's ridiculous that I'm fighting against American planes. I want to go to their country and become an American citizen someday. That's my goal was. But one time, that occasion, he was right in the gun sight. Then right behind the MiG was there. And if I fired them, I could have shot down both American plane and the MiG. But then I get into big trouble. Why did you shut down the MiG? So, of course, I didn't shoot. I didn't fire. So that's the best opportunity. I could have shot down American plane and MiG together, because both are right there going through my gun sight. So I didn't pull the trigger. But anyway, first time I fired the gun, I was frightened. You know, MiG has that 23 millimeter automatic cannon and the 37 millimeter automatic cannon. 33 millimeter cannon, it has a big shell. If that hit the B-29, they make a hole, 1 meter diameter hole. And you pull that trigger, first time I pulled it, man, that was vicious. You know, it looks like I'm sitting on the cannon platform and fire the cannon, just coming out. Then plane shot, shaking, and the tracer goes out. I was shaken up when I fired. Yeah, we never fired that during the practice. That was the mistake for not firing the gun during the practice.
So Ken, you survived the war, and about 7 weeks after the war was over, you had an opportunity to fly to South Korea. When you took off that day, September 21st, 1953, did you know what would happen to your friends and perhaps to your family?
The defector after me told me that the North Koreans executed 5 MiG pilots, including my best friend, because of me. Because they accused them that they should have known that what I was thinking of. Why they didn't know. So they executed 5 MiG pilots.
And you made that decision to defect, knowing that this could happen.
Yeah, I knew that. I knew that my best friend would die.
Explain your thinking. How did you persuade yourself that it was the right thing to go?
Well, I was thinking of escaping all my life. In fact, in 1945, I wanted to go to South Korea, then end up with the U.S. someday. But when I was in the Air Force on that September 1st, that's the best opportunity I ever had. I was flying myself. Of course, if I fly with my wingman, I can fly and I can just rough maneuvering. I can get out of him and escape. But since I'm flying all by myself, my full concentration was on escaping and how to avoid the American planes if they shoot at me, how to signal them and land on the U.S. airbase. So that was the best opportunity I had. That's why I escaped on that date.
Why didn't the Americans shoot you down when they saw you coming?
very lucky on that date. That's my luckiest day in my life. American at Kimpo Air Base, that's the main American F-86 air base, with a big radar on the radar hill. They knew everything about the planes flying around the North Korean skies. That morning, they shut down the radar for the maintenance work. So it was shut down. If a radar was just shut down, they don't know what's going on in the air. Not like World War I, and they used binoculars to see the enemy planes. They rely on radars. So they didn't know. That's why when I was approaching the runway, nobody gave any attention. Some American planes went left, right there, about 2 miles from the airport. They were flying around slowly, making circle, and didn't give me any attention. I thought, gee, what's going on? And I thought, gee, this is glad that I don't have to worry about them for shooting at me. So I started then going down and landing. Only thing I was afraid of was that the anti-aircraft gunners might shoot at me. Normally it's very hard to shoot down flying a plane from the anti-aircraft gunners at that time. They have to aim and visual aim and pull the trigger. However, plane is coming down slowly, straight line, and try to come down to the runway and try to land. That's not that hard to shoot down. If you're hit by the cannon, then I'm dead. So I tried to signal them that please don't shoot me. Only I can do was that to slow down with opening up brake, lowering the flaps and the landing gear, and I rock the plane left and right. That means don't shoot at me. And then last thing I did was that the MiG had color flares. In color flares they use for the emergency, for distress signal. So I fired 4, yellow, red, green, and white, one by one for a few seconds later. Then meant I'm in distress. Please send the emergency trucks and the ambulance to where I'm landing because I'm ready to crash. That's why I try to give a signal to anti-aircraft gunners. That means please don't shoot at me. That's what I meant. So then I went out and landed. But those anti-aircraft gunners never saw me. The war was over. They were not looking at the skies. Except when I passed over their head, one guy called me from Pennsylvania 40 years later. The newspaper said I'm teaching the Embry-Riddle at University of Florida. So he called Embry-Riddle, and he tracked me down. He said I was an anti-aircraft gunner sitting there. When we saw plane going over our head, they didn't know the white plane coming down wrong way. Wind is blowing from north to south. You're not supposed to land on the north to south. But I cannot go around and land from the other side. Then they see me and they shoot at me. So I have to come down as soon as possible, any way possible, then touch down on the runway. I thought that after I touch down, then I'm safe. So he said that when they saw me, I was over their head. Then they all shouted in unison that that's enemy MiG. So they cannot shoot at me because I passed over their head. So then I landed on the runway. Then what? Am I safe after touchdown runway? No. American plane landed from the other side. So I almost lost my life after landing. I thought after landing I'm safe. But American plane landed from the other side. I landed from north to south. We passed at high speed. If we had a head-on collision, we were both killed. The American pilots were mad at me. He said that this goddamn MiG landed is on the runway. He said when he landed there.
Yeah.
So then I taxied out of there and went to the planes were lying down on the F-86 were lying down on the little bit distance away. I thought that's a good place to go and park next to that plane I used to fight in the air. So I went there without any hesitation. I cannot ask anybody, where am I going? Where can I park? This is my own initiative. So I just went there just went there and parked next to one F-86. That pilot I met 56 at the Niagara Falls in New York, an Aero Club meeting. I gave a speech, he gave a speech. He told me that he was sitting in that plane and he noticed that the MiG was landing from the wrong way. Oh no, some plane was landing from the wrong way. He thought that was the American nuts landing from the wrong way. And then he was reading the magazine, and he lifted up the head, and he noticed that the plane was taxiing toward him. And he noticed that that's an enemy plane. He said, what? Geez. He thought that he was almost petrified. He thought that I would be firing at him. So he was thinking of firing at me, pull the trigger. If he fired that machine gun at me, I probably got killed there. So after landing, I almost killed twice. But anyway, after landed, I parked next to him. I got out of the plane. He got out of the plane. We met in the middle of the plane. Of course, he was round-eyed. What could I do? I just went to. Then I saluted at him, give a good will, and we shook hands. And then, of course, I cannot speak English. He's not going to stop teaching English in 1948. From 1948 to 1953, that's a very important age to learn the foreign language. They replaced that by the Russian. I learned the Russian very well, and the Russian doesn't work. I cannot speak the American with the Russian.
So what did you say?
So I shouted with some word, motor car. Why did that I recalled from the English at the middle school. What I meant was that please someone bring the motor car and take me to the headquarters. Yeah, I cannot say that. All I can say was motor car. I shouted loudly. Then the guy who first American I met, you know, by then all kind of people came over there, and pandemonium was going on, and nobody gave me any attention to me. That's why I shouted. Then the fellow, first American I met, he brought a jeep and stopped near me, the covered jeep. And he said, "Here's a motor car." So I jumped on the jeep and sat on the back seat. And then he drove, and another pilot was in the front seat of the jeep, and drove me across the runway to the headquarters. When we were crossing over the runway, you know, that the guy sitting beside him in front seat fingered at my waist. I said, I wonder what he wants. Then I know he pointed at my this holster, automatic pistol in my waist. He wanted that. And I realized that I'm an enemy pilot. I shouldn't have a weapon in my waist. So I took off my, gun, took off from my body. I gave him. Boy, I was very sad to give that away because that pistol was part of my body. I had it more than two years, and I felt like I cut my arm and give it to him. But I had no choice. I gave him.
Let me give the context of what his landing meant. The next day, there was a 7-column, top of the front page headline in the Washington Post that says, "Red MiG lands at Seoul." And there was a similar headline in every newspaper in the world. He was the most famous fighter pilot on Earth for several years. But certainly that week, he was incredibly famous. The night before he landed, his great leader was in Moscow, vacuuming up money from Stalin's successors. Kim Il-sung had probably the most successful night of begging in the history of North Korea. He rounded up grants and aid to basically subsidize the rebuilding of North Korea. So he went to bed that night, having had one of the best nights of his life. And then he woke up in the morning to the news that this man had stolen one of his MiGs. And what Kim Il-sung's reaction was, no one ever knew. Eisenhower actually offered to give back the aircraft. But the Soviets, who denied that they had those aircraft in that part of the world, they didn't ask for one, and the North Koreans never asked for one. So the aircraft now is in a museum in Ohio, right?
Yes, Air Force Museum.
Right. But last thing I wanted to ask you about is that because he was so famous, because it was such a huge story, the U.S. Air Force decided to maximize the propaganda value of Ken. So they held a press conference the next day the day after you arrived. And it was a huge press conference with hundreds of reporters from all over the world, because the foreign press was still in Seoul because the Korean War had only ended 7 weeks earlier. So he walks into a pandemonium press conference. Before he gets there, though, the friendly American CIA guy tells him to lie about what happened to him when he was a pilot. What did they ask you to lie about?
Yeah, they asked me that. One guy asked me that did the American plane ever flew in the Chinese sky? So I told him that, oh sure, we had dog fights every day. So he begged me that please don't tell them. Yeah, so I had to lie.
Because American policy was not to enter Chinese airspace, but in fact the American aces, the people who were most successful at shooting down MiGs, they routinely crossed into Manchuria and shot down MiGs as they were taking off and landing, and that's how most of them got to be aces. But it was all kept secret for a very long time, really not until the 60s and 70s did it come out.
Yeah, about half of the wartime they didn't cross the Yalu River. First I went to the end of the war, they were not chasing the MiGs to the Chinese skies. So all we had to do was that enter the Chinese airspace. Then Americans stopped there until April, first week of April 1952. So I thought that, gee, this is interesting. I can survive. All I have to do is go back and cross the border, and then Americans don't come. But second week of April 1952, that's over. Americans started coming in. Of course, Americans lie, they say. They say the hot pursuit. That's not hot pursuit. You're shooting down the plane taking off.
So the Americans asked you to lie, and did you?
Yeah, that's a press conference.
Yeah.
Yeah, then I had no choice. But also, you see, I thought that's sort of they even out. Both lied. The Soviet Union lied that the Soviet plane never flew in the Korean War. That's a big lie. When 1950, there was not a single MiG was flown by non-Soviet pilots. This is that kind of lie. That's an obvious lie. In 1950, only Soviet Unions had MiG pilots. Then they entered the war. They said we didn't fight in the Korean War. Chinese and North Koreans flew.
So you were familiar with the big lie.
Yeah, that's both lies.
Yeah.
Cancel out sort of. Yeah, I knew that when I was in North Korea that both sides were lying. So what can I do? Russian didn't fight. American didn't fight in the Chinese airspace. So they didn't push too much anyway. However, my political commander, one time one guy asked him that how can we stop those American planes flying into the Chinese airspace? He was honest and responded. He said, are you crazy? You take up here and go out and fight and you come back. Why can't they come back and shoot you down? And he told me. That was true. I realized that that makes sense. You go from there and fight and you go back and you cannot stop there. That's like in World War II. German planes take off from Switzerland and fight against the Allied air forces that they want to go back to Switzerland. Then why not you go back and shoot that plane down? That's what I felt. So
Okay.
they didn't have much to say about why Americans fighting Chinese air.
So questions about this book or about the Escape from Camp 14? Yes.
Okay. Hello?
Yeah.
Is it working? Hi, my name is David Tian. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown University. I'm also the translator of Sebastian Ferretti and Eunju Kim's book, 1,000 Miles to Freedom, which you read and commented on, so thank you for that. So given Shin Dong-hyuk's recent revelations, obviously North Korea has been trying to assassinate him and other defectors' characters for quite some time. Could you comment on a little bit on the implications of these recent revelations on like other defectors' testimonies as evidence?
Right. Well, it's damaged the momentum. It's weakened the momentum for a UN vote, a UN Security Council vote to refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court for trial for crimes against humanity. That's simply true. I did not know about Shin's change story until January. And then I found out, and I rushed to Seoul and talked to him for 2 weeks to find out the degree to which his story differed from the story that he had told me and which he had been telling consistently for 10 years since he arrived. And it's been several weeks since I talked to him, and I've thought it through pretty carefully. And he changed dates and places for major events in his life. However, the major events in his life did occur. He was born in a concentration camp. There's a very high likelihood that he was born in Camp 14, and the borders of the camp were shifted when he was between 4 and 7 years old. And North Korea's own maps show that. And the birthplace, his birthplace, has been attested to by his father in a propaganda film that North Korea has released. North Korea has also confirmed that his mother and brother were publicly executed in and I've talked to eyewitnesses to that public execution. Shin was there. And Shin's own body, one of the things I wanted to show you when this question came up, because it tends to be, the questions about Shin and his story tend to become a question of journalistic ethics, or was the story precisely as told? The pictures show, and I took the pictures just when I was interviewing him in January, they show horrible scars on his back, on his legs, on his hands. And the scars are of a severity that no other individual, nobody else who's come from North Korea and has come out of those camps is as scarred as Shin. So he is by far the most physically traumatized of all the people who've come. And 60 camp survivors have now been interviewed and have been written up by David Hawk and others in various human rights journals. So he's the most physically scarred. But also Shin's story, he underplayed some of the things that happened to him. He was ashamed of his behavior when he had his fingernails. His fingernails were all pulled out in a variant of a Japanese torture. And he did not handle that torture well. And he was ashamed of the way he handled it. So he never mentioned the fingernail torture until January to me. So I think that fundamentally his story is true, and that he was tortured and raised in a political labor camp in a way that is a profound violation of any human rights standards in the world. And North Korea has seized on the discrepancies in his story, but I don't think by any measure they discount the larger truth of what he went through. And there are 60 other people who've given similar testimonies, and they've come from various eras, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even in the past 15 years they've come. And they all tell the same stories in separate interviews over separate years about how the camps are operated. So, and then the satellite pictures of the camps now are becoming more precise, higher definition, and so the level of proof of the existence of the camps and the pervasiveness of a human rights atrocity it's overwhelming. And that's what the UN concluded in its investigation last year. However, Shin's changed story, because of the profile that he attained, in part because of my book, it's damaged momentum, clearly.
Thank you.
Well, I don't. If you're going to ask a follow-up question, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's a different question. So go ahead, ma'am.
Okay. So you talked. I'd love to ask about MiG Alley, but you talked about Kim Il-sung, and it's understandable. He was a Stalin-esque sort of figure. He'd been in it at the beginning. He had many years of experience. What about his son and his grandson? How are they able to hang on in such a terribly repressed state without any? I mean, how can they? How come they seem to be Kim Il-sung can't protect them now? How is it that they've been able to manage to keep the country repressed as it is?
Because they use the Stalinist tools that the great leader set up. Repression in North Korea now under Kim Jong-un is probably greater than it's been under his father. The labor camps have expanded in some areas. There are satellite images showing new construction. Crossing the border into China has become dramatically more difficult than it was in the 1990s. The size of the secret police, which has been estimated by the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea at 270,000 secret police. They are everywhere, and they continue to do their job. Dissent does not exist. Civil society does not exist. The internet does not exist. The way that any society foments revolution is people meet, they discuss, they spread the word. And there's more information going into North Korea than there ever been because of electronics, smaller radios, USB fobs, video cameras, DVDs. People are much more knowledgeable about the outside world, but they remain physically and psychologically atomized from each other. And there's no civil society, and the presence of 270,000 secret police keeps the society fearful, and what enforces the fear is the camps. They're a very important tool. And closing the camps, which is, something that North Korea could do to get a lot of public relations cred and perhaps help its economy, is something that a lot of analysts believe they can't do because they need that fear to survive. It's not that people in North Korea are ignorant about their condition or about the prosperity of the world around them. It's just that they are powerless to do anything about it because they're afraid.
Interesting. Thank you.
Henry.
Yes, Mr. Rowe, it's a great honor to see you here. And I grew up reading about you a couple of times in history books and stuff, so it's great that this book is finally out. So my question is, I don't know how often you've had the chance to go back to South Korea, or I'm sure you're aware of the situation in South Korea regarding the political climate in recent years. You have the situation where openly pro-North Korean people are becoming National Assembly men and women in South Korea. The National Assembly is not able to pass the human rights legislation for North Korea and human rights, and all these things going on. And I'm just wondering, as somebody who escaped from North Korea, who made the decision to come out, looking at the situation in South Korea, what do you see, what do you feel when you look at sort of the lack of improvement in terms of South Korean society or government, or the way they're dealing with the way the pro-North Korean sentiments and the leftists and all those people in South Korea who are trying to undermine society and government there? And I just wanted to get your views on that. And sort of related to what the other lady asked regarding Kim Jongun, your personal thoughts on how long he would last as the regime leader. So thank you. And Blaine, you could answer also.
Yes. I visited South Korea for half dozen times. My last visit was 1979. So since then, I didn't go to South Korea for a long time. So I don't know since then. But when I was there, before 1979, whenever I went to South Korean Air Force gave one intelligence officer, colonel, to take care of me so that I know where to go. So he helped me quite a bit. Even that time, because I escaped to North Korea to South Korea in 1953, then left Korea right away. And then the first visit I had was 1970. You see, I was very poor at the Korean language, even though I spoke. Then they kept taking me to the TV stations and asked me questions. So I had a tough time. But anyway, I enjoyed talking to the South Koreans on newspapers, TVs. But anyway, what you asked me was about what I think of North Korea. They haven't changed even now. Same thing was going on. And I don't know how to change it in North Korea. I hope that somehow North Koreans will rise and overthrow that regime. But to do so, somebody do something. They almost did in 1953, before the war was ended. One man by name of Ilsung. He tried to overthrow the Kim Il-sung, but replaced by the domestic communist leader by name of Park Hun-young. Park Hun-young was a Korean communist, not the outside communist. He was in South Korea. Then he went to North Korea and became a foreign minister. And Ilsung was when North Koreans came down to South Korea during the war, he was a mayor of the Seoul. So when they retreated back to North Korea, and then Ilsung became a North Korean Workers' Party first secretary. And he tried to overthrow the Kim Il-sung regime and set the Park Hun-young to become a head of the North Korea. If he succeeded, North Korea would be much better off. Even though communists, they can change. But he failed, and all those were executed, including him, Ilsung, Park Hun-young, North Korean ambassador to the Soviet Union was executed also. So their punishment was so severe that North Korea is not there to rise against the North Korean government.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, predicting the end of the regime is a fool's game, I think. We have time for 2 more questions. Any others?
Okay, I have one.
Oh. Okay. My comments on that is I really don't. I'm not covering that right now, and I don't have a sophisticated answer to give you.
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm Louise Van Horn, the legislative chair for the North Korea Freedom Coalition. And I didn't know whether you were aware that we are having North Korea Freedom Week, April 26th to May 2nd in Washington, D.C. And I want to invite you both to come and also to give everybody in this room a heads up that it will be coming, and watch for the publicity. Invite you also to participate.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Yes.
A question for Blaine Harden.
Yeah.
When you're doing a reporting and you're interviewing North Koreans, do you do anything differently from when you report on another topic, just given the difficulty of confirming a personal story, an anecdote, or an event that you probably couldn't confirm in North Korea? How do you go about doing that, and how do you get confident that what you're being told, you believe in it, or you gain confidence?
That's a very good question, and I think I have a very good answer. I've sort of interviewed the alpha and omega of North Korean defectors. I wish dictators. For Ken is probably the most well-documented defector in the history of North Korea. He arrived in a MiG, so it was clear that he was a MiG pilot. Otherwise, he wouldn't have arrived.
First one.
Yeah, he
first
was
defector after ceasefire. I was at number 1.
and he
After
arrived.
that-
He arrived too with his flight records, with records for receiving medals, and then the Americans sat him down for 7 months. 5-6 hours a day, 5 days a week for 7 months, and vacuumed his mind. Intelligence people from the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and Central Intelligence, the CIA.
Right.
And then they wrote it all up, and they put it in a file that they kept secret until about 4 months before he telephoned me and asked me if I knew who he was. I didn't, but I soon found out. And I soon found out that this file was available. And I used that file, and it was highly detailed about, he knew, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of the operation of the war, of the Air Force, of the society. He's educated as a technocrat. He was not traumatized. He was not tortured. He lived a middle-class life. He had loving parents. So if there is a normal person that defected from North Korea, a normal kind of technocratic Washington kind of person that we could identify with, it's him. Okay? But most defectors are not like that. Most come from impoverished areas. There are survivors of often severe famine in the 1990s, where many people witnessed the starvation deaths of relatives, of their own parents, of siblings. So they saw things as young people that have really affected their ability to tell a straight linear story. And Shin Dong-yuk is even farther to the other end of the spectrum. He was raised in a concentration camp, was tortured there, lived in fear, and watched his mother and brother executed. In fact, he turned them in. He betrayed his own family. So he was a most unreliable narrator, and there were no records of his life. And there were no witnesses to his life at the time that I interviewed him and did the book. But people who did interview him, who had interviewed every other defector from the camps, said he knew things about the camp that you could only know if you were there. And his psychological affect was that of a deeply traumatized person. So he was the real deal, and his body was covered in these horrifying scars. But the dates and times of his life, there was no way to document that. And so in interviewing these people from North Korea, and there are now 28,000 of them living in South Korea, it's extremely difficult because they're all, one psychologist I talked to at a reception center that basically brings all the North Koreans together for sort of re-education, 6 weeks to 8 weeks period at Hanwon outside of Seoul. They say it's fair to describe every single defector as clinically paranoid. It's a useful adaptation to life in North Korea, but it's not a useful adaptation for giving a good interview. And so it takes a really long time to get these people to open up. And when they do, they often tell you stories that they think are true, but they use to hide behind. In Shin's case, he didn't want to talk about how they pulled all his fingernails out. He didn't want to talk about the way he had betrayed his mother and brother because he was ashamed of it. And he was so deeply ashamed of it that he'd sort of forgotten what the truth was. And only when he was reminded by the appearance of his father in a video last fall did Shin come clean with a straighter story. Am I convinced that his story now is the kind of straight linear story I would get from Ken? No. And that's just the that's the issue when you deal with traumatized people. It's true in North Korea. It's true in Cambodia. It's true in Bosnia from traumatized people. If I had a chance to do it all over again, I would have understood more about trauma and worked more of that into Escape from Camp 14. But having said that, I did say in the book, I had 2 whole chapters about how he was a liar. But the depth of his trouble with the truth was something that I'm still understanding, still trying to get my head around.
One more thing about my MiG. The press said, keep saying that I brought the MiG-15 to the United States and received the money. So I became a mullah man. I was not happy to hear that. The Soviet defectors, they gave some money, never said nothing. For me, every time my name comes out, mullah, I
have to explain that. There was an Operation Moolah. The U.S. Air Force had offered $100,000 in 1953 to the first pilot to bring a red MiG to a U.S. Air Force base. When he landed his plane, everybody at the Air Force base assumed he had come for the moolah. But in fact, he had heard nothing about this offer, and all these questions, all these statements, oh, you're a rich man now, he didn't know what the hell they were talking about.
Yeah, also that, they got more out of me other than MiG or informations. American intelligence was dropping spies in North Korea, spend millions of dollars, and they all disappearing. Nobody comes out back. They got that from me. So they took me out of South Korea to Okinawa. Why they did that? General Mark Clark, he was the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Far East Command. He guaranteed that any person bringing the MiG-15 to South Korea, his life, his refugee, safety, humane care, and personal attention. He guaranteed. At the same time, he want to take information out of me. So best place would be take me out of Korea and some safe place. So they took me to the Okinawa.
Where they
Then-
enrolled you for 6 months.
Yeah, then you see, I became an employee of the U.S. government. They took me to the office. They said, raise your hand. Then I became a U.S. government employee. So I received a monthly salary. Then I lived on my own money. Went to PX store and I bought the thing. Also, I went to the officers club. I paid for very reasonable. I spent about $2 a day for the meal, and the housing was free, and I had a free Jeep to drive around. They told me that don't drive around too far, because if I hit something, they get into trouble. If I get injured, they get in trouble. Commander guaranteed my safety. That made the South Koreans angry because, I'm supposed to be a South Korean citizen. All the Koreans are the South Korean citizens. But they didn't even know where I went. Disappeared. So finally,
Your identity and your whereabouts was secret for
that was secret.
for a long time. So
Yeah.
I think we've run out of time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.